I'd like to turn to the book of Jeremiah. Book of Jeremiah. Coming to Jeremiah, the northern kingdom of Israel had already been in Assyrian captivity for about 100 years. And the southern kingdom of Judah was again following the same course that led to the captivity of the northern kingdom. So the book of Jeremiah brings us to the last days of the southern kingdom. Covers the reigns of the last 5 kings leading into Babylonian captivity. The time period would be 2 Kings chapters 22 through 25 and 2 Chronicles chapters 34 through 36. So if you want to get what's going on during the book of Jeremiah, you read 2 Kings 22 through 25 and 2 Chronicles 34 through 36. So God raises up Jeremiah to preach to the southern kingdom in their last days. And he would be the last preacher that God would send to warn them of the coming judgment of God before he turned the people over to Babylon. Jeremiah preached for about 40 years. Not a single positive result. And God would give Jeremiah the messages that he would have him to preach. This is indicated throughout the book by the repeated statement, the word of the Lord came to him. The word of the Lord came to him. You read that over and over. And one such incident is in Jeremiah 18. If we turn there, Jeremiah chapter 18. We'll read the first 6 verses. The word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Arise, go down to the potter's house, and there I will cause thee to hear my words. That is, you go down there, and I will give you the message when you're there. Then I went down to the potter's house, and behold, he, the potter, wrought a work on the wheels. And the vessel that he made of clay was marred in the hand of the potter. So he made it again, another vessel, as seemed good to the potter to make it. Then, after he observed these things, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, this is God delivering the message to Jeremiah. O house of Israel, cannot I do with you as this potter, saith the Lord. Behold, as the clay is in the potter's hand, so are ye in mine hand, O house of Israel. In verses 1 and 2, the Lord instructs Jeremiah, go to the potter's house. The reason? There I will cause thee to hear my words. At the potter's house, he would receive the message from the Lord for the people. When Jeremiah arrives at the potter's house, verse 3, he stood there and he observed some things. It says, and behold. And I believe he stood there in silence. And we're told that the first thing he observed was the potter. And behold, he. He also observed that the potter was working. It says he wrought a work. He also observed the wheels. He wrought a work on the wheels. In verse 4, he observed the clay and the vessel that he made of clay. Fine grained earth that can be molded when wet and then dried and baked to make bricks, pottery, etc. In observing the clay, he noticed that it was marred. That is, it was disfigured. And he also observed that it was in the hand of the potter. He also observed that the potter was having his way with the clay. Has seemed good to the potter to make it. I believe all of this is a literal event. Jeremiah literally went down to the potter's house, and all of this wasn't a dream. This was a literal event. And as Jeremiah stood there observing, the message of God came to him to deliver to the people. We see that in verse 5. The specifics of the message are recorded in verses 6 through verse 10. Now, in the context, the message that Jeremiah received and was to declare to the people was God is God. God is God. God is the sovereign potter. You are the clay, and He has indisputable authority and right to do whatever He pleases with you. That was the message that Jeremiah was to deliver to the people. That seems to be the message of the text. But there are also some wonderful truths and application here for you and I concerning our salvation that we want to see in the potter's house. The subject of the message is salvation pictured in the potter's house. In this message, we want to take a trip to the potter's house. And what we see there, we want to apply to God's plan of redemption, God's plan of salvation. We want to consider three main points. Number one, the clay is found. Number two, the clay is fashioned. And number three, the clay is finished. So first of all, let's consider the clay is found. When Jeremiah arrived at the potter's house, the clay was already in the potter's hand. And he was fashioning it, shaping it, molding it on the wheel. That presupposes something. The clay had already been dug up from its natural surroundings when Jeremiah got to the potter's house. Now, today, potters do not have to dig their own clay. They can get it mail order. They can go to the store and buy it. But this potter would have dug his own clay. The clay does not seek the potter. The clay cannot seek the potter. The clay doesn't just show up at the potter's house. The potter goes to where the clay is. Maybe in the pasture. It may be in the swamp. It may be way down in some pit. But wherever it is, the potter goes to where the clay is, and he finds it. And he gets there and he takes his shovel or his hand, puts his shovel or his hand into the ground. He grabs hold and he begins to twist and turn and pull, rooting the clay from its natural surroundings. Until then, the clay is bound in its natural surroundings and will remain there until the potter comes and breaks earth's hold and looses it. Before that potter ever goes to where the clay is and digs it up, he has something in mind concerning that clay. You have a piece of clay. That potter digs that clay up. He has something in mind, perhaps this, perhaps this, perhaps this. But he has something in mind for this for this lump of clay. He doesn't just see a lump of clay. He sees this. He looks at this clay and he sees this. I will take this clay and I will do this. So he sees that clay, but he doesn't just see a lump of clay. He sees what he has in mind for that clay. So it is with our salvation. When the potter goes to where the clay is and finds it and loosens it and removes it from its natural surroundings, he will at some point begin to pick out the rocks and the pebbles and the sticks and the roots and the bugs. All of this a picture of salvation. Just as that clay does not seek the potter, you and I did not seek God. Romans 3 verse 11, there is none that seeketh after God. And just as that clay does not find the potter, I did not find God. But He sought and He found me. I did not find God, nor was I interested in God, nor did I have any desire for God. I was just a lump of clay, filled with all kinds of debris, rooted in our natural surroundings. We would have remained there. But God, in His love, in His grace, in His mercy, had an interest in this lump of clay. Had an interest in me. And He had something in mind for me. Interested in me to make me something useful. That again is a picture of salvation. And He comes to our natural surroundings of sin and ungodliness and wickedness and vileness and filth and perversion. Comes into my natural surroundings of enmity and defiance and rebellion and irreverence and ignorance toward God. He comes into my natural surroundings of lifelessness. This clay can do nothing. It's lifeless. It can do nothing. Comes into our surroundings of darkness and gloom and misery. And he begins to twist and he begins to turn. And eventually he uproots us from the earth and he breaks us loose. And he frees us, lifting us and bringing us out of our natural surroundings where we were born. We're told in Isaiah 51 in verse 1, look to the hole and pit whence you're digged. Every now and then we need to take a look back there. We don't need to go back there. But every now and then in our mind we need to remember the pit out of which we have been digged. God the potter dug and pulled us out of that pit. This clay is dug from the earth, and just as it is unsuitable for the potter's wheel. It's unsuitable. So the potter, with his hands, begins to remove the sticks. He begins to remove the sticks one by one until it becomes, and then he begins to work with his hands on that clay. And he begins to shape it. And perhaps he gets it to something like this, a little different from this. But he begins to work on that clay. And eventually, it's suitable for the wheel. Again, he carries that clay to his house. He not only uproots the clay, he carries it to his house. And unless something stronger than the clay and its surroundings remove it, you and I would have forever remained a lump of clay. But it took hands stronger than the clay, took hands stronger than its surroundings to uproot it. God came and he broke the hold of my natural surroundings. And he pulled me out. But the story doesn't end there. If such were the case, we'd still be this. If that's all he did, was dig us out of our natural surroundings, we would forever be this. But the story doesn't end there. So the clay is found. The second point is the clay is fashioned. Making a mess up here. The clay is fashioned. When Jeremiah arrived at the potter's house, clay had already been dug up. Clay had already been brought to the house. So you have this lump of clay. And if it's ever going to amount to anything other than this, it must be carried to the potter's house. And he has to do a work upon it. And he has to do a work within it. Once the clay was in the potter's house, the potter might place it upon the ground and walk upon it. To break down some of the lumps. This practice is referred to in Isaiah 41:25 as the potter treadeth clay. As the potter treadeth clay. So perhaps he would put that clay in the ground and walk on it. I'm not going to do that. I don't want to mess up the rug. And he begins to work. with that clay. And he begins to get rid of some of the bumps, some of the bubbles. Perhaps he would widen it here, thicken it here, thin it down here, press here, press here. But the potter begins to work on that clay. And one thing for sure, the clay would have the impress of the potter's hand. It would have the impress of the fingers of the potter. Again, when Jeremiah got to the potter's house, the potter had the clay in his hands, and he was forming it into a vessel. He was working with that clay. The potter was working with that clay. And he has a thought in mind. He's working with that clay, and he has this in his mind. What he's going to cause that clay to become. And he's working that thought into the clay. It says in verse 3 of our text, he wrought a work on the wheels. The potter would sit before two parallel stone wheels, a lower and larger wheel connected by an axle to an upper wheel. The potter would turn the lower wheel with his feet, which of course in turn turned the upper wheel. And the potter, with the clay in his hand, would begin to shape with the wheels that clay. The wheels represent the providence of God. We see this in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 1. We're not going to turn there. But the wheels represent the providence of God. The providence of God are the happenings of life. And He's in complete control of the wheels. And the potter is fashioning that once lump of clay with his skillful hands, using the wheel, using the happenings of life. And again, he's in complete control of the wheel, and he's in complete control of the clay. And as he applies the wheel to the clay, that clay never leaves his hands. And so it is with the happenings of life. God's in control of it all, and here we are. In His hand, He's fashioning and shaping us, pressing gently where He needs to press gently, pressing firmly where He needs to press firmly. He knows that piece of clay. He knows everything about it. He sees every deformity. He also has a plan in mind. And He's working that plan. He knows how to handle that specific clay. Perhaps He handles this clay differently than this one. But He knows. He knows how to handle each piece of clay. And again, He gently touches areas of that clay. In other areas, He presses more firmly. He knows. He knows. So we see the potter there. He's handling the clay, shaping it according to His purpose. In verse 6, we read those words, As the clay is in the potter's hand, so are ye in mine hand. The clay in the potter's hand. Through all the changes of my life, whether it be changes in circumstances, changes in place, emotional changes, physical changes, spiritual changes, this is where I am, in the hand of the potter. Never leave the hand of the potter. No matter what comes into our life, we're in the hand of the potter. And we're shaped and formed according to his pleasure. Something that's not mentioned in the text that would have been in the potter's house is water. The potter, while fashioning that clay, would continually wet it with water, making it pliable. Water, of course, is a type of the Word of God. He applies the water to the clay. That's what he's doing with us right now. The potter's working on that clay. It's a picture of the patience of God. And be sure of this: the more that clay is handled by the potter, the more beautiful it becomes, the more shapely it becomes, the more formed it becomes. And eventually, that lump of clay is this. It's this. The more he handles it, the more beautiful it becomes. Notice verse 4. The vessel that he made of clay has seemed good to the potter to make it. The vessel that he made of clay, has it seemed good to him to make it. So you go from this to maybe this to this or to this. Maybe even he paints it and puts a design on it in this. But regardless, it all started with this. This is where it all started. That clay being lifted from its natural surroundings. And all along, that potter is looking beyond that lump of clay. And he sees the vessel that he's going to make. You take an artist or a craftsman. Whatever it is that they're working with, they don't just see that object. They see what they're going to make of it. Someone else may say, well, what would you want that piece of junk for? Oh, because I'm going to make it into this. And that's God. That's God with you and I. By the time you get from this lump of clay to one of these vessels, God's hand is all over you. His fingerprints are all over you. We did not just evolve from this to this. God's hand is all over us. You see, we became one of these vessels as a result of the handiwork of God. Ephesians 2 verse 10, we, that is the saved by grace, are His workmanship. He's the workman. We're the object of the work. From this to this. From this to this. It's God's business. It's God's business if He wants to make you this. If He wants to make you this. It's God's business. But whatever vessel you are, this is where you were. Until God lifted you from your natural surroundings. And again, if we're saved, we're no longer this. We're no longer this. We're one of these vessels. They're not all the same. Not all the same size. Not all the same shape. They're different. But they all have a use. They all have several uses. And it's God, the potter, who determines their use. It's God, the potter, who determines where this piece will go, where this piece might go, how they'll be used. They're all the loving and gracious work of His hands. All different, but all the loving work of His hands. When you view a lost sinner, this is what you might see. And you think, they're useless. Yeah, so were you. We were all this lump of clay. But God can take that lost sinner and make him this. But only God can do that. So may we always be mindful. I'm no better than this. I would still be this. I didn't do this. The potter did this. And if the potter didn't work, I'd still be this. In our natural surroundings. So don't ever underestimate what God can do with a lump of clay. Verse 4. Something else we need to be mindful of. The vessel that He made with clay was marred. It became disfigured. As the potter is applying the clay to the wheel, perhaps there's a little pebble down in that clay. And as the wheel works away at that clay, there's that pebble. The wheel hits that pebble. And the clay becomes marred. Becomes disfigured. It becomes disfigured from the pebbles left over from its past life. If you look at any of these things, these were very cheap. But as you look at any of these, you can see flaws. You can see flaws. They're not perfect. They're not perfect. But I want to tell you something. When I look at this, that's all I do see. It's flaws. This is quite an improvement from this. Still disfigured. Still not perfect. But its flaws are becoming less and less obvious. As the potter works on that clay with his hands, the flaws become less and less obvious. That's how it ought to be in our lives. We're all disfigured. Some different ways than others. But there's still those pebbles from that old life that pop up every now and then. But the more he works on the clay, the less and less we see of the disfigure. You take our attitudes, our actions from the sinful nature, and from time to time they come to the surface. But that disfigured pottery is still in the hands of the potter. And he's still working on it. In his grace, in his mercy. And as he works on that piece of clay that he's shaping into a vessel, with a skillful hand he removes the debris that pops up every now and then as he's working. We may no longer, due to the love and grace and mercy of God, be a lump of clay. But we're all disfigured. We're all disfigured. Some are more useful than others. Some vessels have more uses than other vessels. Some vessels have more of the fingerprints of God upon them than other vessels. Some might be more beautiful than others, more appealing. But they're all disfigured. They're all disfigured. Marred, yes. We're all marred. But we're in the hand of the potter. Big difference. Yes, we're marred. But we're still in the hand of the potter. He's still working. He's not finished with us yet. Which brings us to the finished product. Marred in the hand of the potter. But then notice, so he made it again. Another vessel. He brought us out of the hold of our natural surroundings. And when he did, he knew what he would do with us. And he's been working on us. But we're all disfigured. But he's not done yet. He's not done yet. We read in Philippians 1, verse 6, He which hath begun a good work in you. That work began with this. And he which hath begun a good work in you will perform it. Will continue to work until the day of Jesus Christ. Until, so there's coming a day it's going to be finished. Even this isn't finished yet because there's still some imperfections. There's still imperfections. It's still marred. So he's not finished with it yet. He's going to make another vessel. And all the sin, and all the impurities, and all the imperfections will be forever gone. Notice in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Verse 42. So also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown in corruption. It is raised in incorruption. New vessel. New vessel. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. All because of the potter. Again, Lamentations 4 and verse 2, we read, the work of the hands of the potter. This perfect vessel will take place in the twinkling of an eye. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 51 through 54. The workmanship of the master potter. And I know this isn't pottery, but this is so you get the idea. Don't worry, Sharon, it's not going to fall. Well, maybe it will. But when we get to heaven, be pure. Be pure. No longer this, but this. No longer this, but this. You see, he's not finished yet with this. This is finished. This is finished. Now, in the typical potter's house, there were 3 areas. There was the back room. That's where the dug up clay is. There's the inner room. That's where the potter works on the clay. That's where Jeremiah is. It's where we are today. The potter's working on the clay. And then there's the front room, the display window, where the finished vessels are displayed. And who gets the glory for this? The potter. The potter. And how did he start? With this. From this to this. From this to this to this. That's you and I. That's salvation. We were dug up by the potter, brought to his house. Now we're in that inner room. He's still working. He's still working on us. And one day, this. One day, no more disfigurement. Everything is perfect. And who will get the glory? The potter. He did it all. He did it all. We are vessels of mercy. We are vessels of mercy. This is a vessel of mercy because it could have been left to be this. So this is a vessel of mercy. And for you and I that are saved, this vessel of mercy, a potter will usually put his mark. These are all machine made, so it doesn't matter. But a potter will usually put his initials or something on the work. We're vessels of mercy. And we have this mark upon us. His. His. We were found by Him, dug up by Him, made by Him. We are His. And yes, this is different than this. Big difference. And people ought to be able to see the difference between you and I and the unsaved sinner. There ought to be a stark difference between this and this. It's not just this and this. These are very similar. But it's this and this. What a difference. But this came from this. It's all due to the potter. So, until we get to heaven, that God's fingerprints would be all over us. Everywhere in our life we can see His fingerprints. Until eventually we are the finished work of His hands. And may I say, the one who began with this and began to work on this, and eventually He brought it to this. He's not going to stop with this, just as He did not stop with this. He's going to keep on working until you have the finished product. So in the potter's house, in the potter's hand, there's hope. There's hope. He's not finished yet with any one of us. Just be thankful that you're in the potter's hand. And no matter what mark that wheel, the happenings of life, may leave on that piece of clay, that piece of pottery, you're in the potter's hand. Can you think of a better place to be? That stone leaves its mark. That stone wheel leaves its mark upon the pottery. But you're in the potter's hand. You never leave. You never leave the potter's hand. And no man can pluck you out of the potter's hand. And no happening of life can pluck you out. Now, in an unskillful hand, working on the potter's wheel, he may lose his grip on the pottery. And there it goes. You don't have to worry about that, because you're in the Lord's hands. And He doesn't let go. And He never loses control of that clay. Never. We are blessed to be in the potter's hand. Brother Ben, if you come and lead us in a verse of song.